Welcome back, y'all. Today I'm going to be converting my vintage steel road bike from having a quill stem to a threadless stem using a quill to threadless stem adapter. I'm going to be showing you the steps it takes and things to consider when you're doing this conversion, and also two major factors, including one that could cause an insanely scary situation that I almost have experienced in the past using a quill stem adapter to a threadless stem. So join me in this journey while I do this project, and hopefully you learn a few things. Now, there's a few things to consider that are kind of a given, whether or not the quill stem adapter is going to work with your setup, if the threadless stem that you're trying to go with fits the quill stem adapter and also the bars. But also, if you have this setup where everything has been wrapped, the brake calipers are at the correct angle that you'd like them at, and also how far you have to take apart the bike in order to do the conversion without going too far, doing too much extra work. But there may be different reasons you want to do this conversion. Maybe you don't like the look of a quill stem. Personally, I prefer the look of a quill stem, and it could be the ease of access where you can experiment with stem length, because a quill stem really requires a lot of effort to change the length to another quill stem, whereas a threadless, you just take it off, put a new one on, and because of the faceplate, you can just swap the stems pretty easily. And as far as this situation for myself, I think that that's what I'm kind of getting at, is I'm gonna shorten up the reach just a tiny bit, because I do have an older video where when I moved back to Florida, I really realized that my bike fit was not as good as it could have been, particularly out climbing the hills out in Vegas. I was always standing up, so I didn't have to adjust my saddle super precise. Now here in Florida, you're sitting most of the time, so I really had to get my saddle adjusted precisely, whereas out in Vegas, I could be a little bit more loose with the adjustment. And this is another thing I'm coming across with my reach on my bike. I feel like it's too long, and shortening up just a tiny bit with this stem that I happen to have will be the temporary solution for now. Am I gonna stay with this threadless stem on this bike? Of course not. In the future, I'm gonna go back to a quill stem, but for now, this is gonna be great to experiment with the reach. And yeah, I know, there are quill stems with removable faceplates, but they are harder to find, especially considering condition, and finding the one in the length you want and working with your bar size is not an easy task. Also, they look good, but not great, so I avoid them with my builds. Also, this quill stem is 120 millimeters long. I want to try something a little bit shorter, and I just so happen to have a 110 millimeter stem. Even though this is a vintage road bike, there still are some modern details that are on it that technically doesn't make it a true vintage bike. For example, the all black hubs, that really wasn't a thing back then. The black tires, usually they are gum wall, and I just have all black tires for now. And another detail that doesn't quite make it vintage is black bar tape. Usually the bar tape of choice was white back then. So just those little things, but that's my whole intent with this build, to throw in some modern little details to make it a nice neo-retro mix. All right, so here's gonna be the general game plan. I'm gonna have to unwrap the bar tape on one side. I'm gonna pick the front caliper, and you'll see in a bit why. Try to preserve the bar tape, because I like to reuse bar tape as much as I can. If anything happens to this bar tape, I do have an extra set of bar tape that I'll just throw on here. I have to make sure that the angle is going to be exactly right for the brake levers. And also with the threadless stem adapter, I have to make sure I can get close to the exact height I have here. I don't think I'm going to achieve that. And the reason being is with this Origin 8 threadless stem adapter, basically you install it like this. It slides to this little section, but that is all you have. So the biggest issue I see when folks use this is they'll have it sticking out of the top of the fork, and it creates this gooseneck effect that just does not look good. Now, if they released a threadless stem adapter that had a little bit more length and then you can add spacers, that'd be pretty cool. I know there's another one that does exist from a different company, but it looks like it's just way too long, and it still creates kind of a goofy look. And my solution that I came up with this is basically have a spacer under it. However, a normal threadless spacer, there's a lot of wiggle room here, and it just will not fit. It's gonna flop everywhere and look terrible. So you have to put material on the inside to tighten up the diameter so it does fit snugly. And it actually does work pretty good. And I've used it on my gravel bike conversion with the flat bars and also the drop bars. And I think it is a great solution, but you can't add too much, because again, then it kind of looks a little odd. You wanna have it as seamless as possible, but also consider your comfort. And another factor to consider is the length of your brake cables and brake cable housing. Now, since the bars are gonna sit a little bit lower and a tiny bit further back, I don't have to worry about the length because now I'm gonna have a little bit of extra length. Whereas if you're doing the opposite, raising it up and moving the bars a little bit more forward, you're gonna have to consider unwrapping both sides and basically just doing a reinstall. You're gonna have to have longer cable length, cable housing, and everything. Other than that, let's get started. All right, first thing I gotta remove this corky mirror. Next, I'm gonna unwrap the bar tape and be as careful as I can. I know that the bar tape has adhesive in the back, which could potentially rip it. Again, I have backup bar tape for this project, but hopefully it does not and I can reuse it. That's what's so annoying about bar tape is the adhesive sometimes is so ridiculous that it just rips little pieces off. All right, so the bar tape came off pretty good. Again, when reinstalling it, most of the time it works, but sometimes it could rip while reinstalling it. Trust me, I know. So this battle is not over with in trying to reuse this bar tape. So hopefully it works out so I don't have to use a brand new set of bar tape. Also, don't you just love either getting a really nice pair or a new old stock aero brake levers where the rubber is still pliable? I mean, that's from the 80s and it is fantastic. Something I do practice though is I'll put hockey tape over the metal bands. Also, if you don't wrap the bar tape precisely, the black hockey tape will cover the metal clamps and can really mask some flaws in regards to your bar tape. So that's why that's on there. Next is taking off the tape that kept the housing in place while wrapping the bars. Lastly, removing my patent pending bad bar wrapper trick. All right, now that that has been completed, there are two major steps that are next. First, I gotta remove the brake lever off the bars so the quill stem can slide off. And I have the angle of the brake levers exactly how I like it. So this is my technique on maintaining the same position when I reinstall them. Now I know this looks goofy with all the markings on here, but it has worked for me in the past on getting the brake levers pretty much exact where it was when I'm reinstalling them. Also, after removing the brake lever, I have to loosen the clamp for the quill stem and the bars and then carefully slide the quill stem off without scratching the bars. But let me get this brake lever off now. Again, you can see my very distinctive Sharpie markings. So when I do line this back up on the bars, it should be almost exact where it was. All right, one major point with quill stems in order to get them off without scratching your bars is most quill stems have a similar design, but not all of them. Some of them have different ways that the bolt screws in, and it might be a little bit difficult to take off. Now, some quill stems, what will happen is the bolt will actually screw on the first part. So you'll use something like a quarter or, for example, a washer, and you'll screw this in and it will open up the band just a little bit, but not too much because then you could wind up bending the clamp portion of the quill stem. But again, there's still different designs. So the threading for this stem is not the bottom portion, but actually in the stem itself. So I can't use that technique. However, if I were using this stem, but this is the mountain bike stem, I'll put the washer in here and potentially push down on my thumb. That might give it enough wiggle room to slide on and off without scratching the bars. Or if I have to go a little more extreme, I'll just use a flathead screwdriver and I'll stick it in between and push down, and that usually helps. Again, like I mentioned, it's a delicate process because you don't want to put too much force and wind up bending the clamp. All right, before I actually commit to removing the quill stem, because you gotta do this all in one go, it's hard to put things down, especially when you're still cabled up and you're by yourself. So there's a little prep work involved. There's two things that I mentioned earlier that could potentially cause kind of a scary situation with one I actually personally experienced. First issue is when you slide this on and you tighten everything down, there could be a situation where if you do want to experiment with the height, and it's sticking out of the fork like this, there's nothing below it. Now on a threadless stem system, there's gonna be spacers under the stem. So let's say in a hypothetical sense, you didn't tighten these down enough, it really can't fall down. Whereas with this quill stem adapter, if you don't tighten it enough and you're out riding and you're pushing force on the bars, this could potentially start coming down and you might not realize it and then completely come off if it has enough room, and that's a loss of control right there. Now, the scary situation that I personally experienced was when I was first using these adapters, I threw on a threadless stem and I was sliding it above where it sits flush on the bottom. And then as you can see, the adapter is sunken in there, and then the top cap was making contact with the threadless stem. So I wound up installing it, tightening down everything, and went for a ride. And this was on my Master TG road bike. I was going down the road and I noticed that my bars are a little bit crooked, and I was really close to home, so I didn't think much of it and I just kept riding. And then next thing you know, I was having a delayed turning response, and that's when I realized that my bars were super loose. And that's where I came to the conclusion of, if you're tightening of the top cap, if you do not have a little bit of the stem adapter sticking up and the top cap is making direct contact, you're actually just tightening it down and pushing the stem down rather than making the wedge nut clamp inside the fork. Therefore, you're just tightening it down and moving the stem. Now, if I would have kept cranking it down, I'm sure it would have wedged totally fine. But the problem was it just had enough tension where I thought it was ready to go, but it was not. So that is a situation that I really want to stress in this video, that I like to make sure that the threadless stem adapter is actually sticking out ever so slightly above the threadless stem, and the top cap is making contact with it, therefore making sure that the tension I feel is going to be the wedge nut inside. But after that disclaimer, let's get this thing going. Also, the bottom of quill stems where it connects to the bars, it does get a little bit more narrow, and that helps navigate the bends of the bars. Now that that's off, let's get the threadless stem on here. All right, there we go. The initial installation is complete. Of course, eventually I'll get the angle of the bars set up correctly and also add that spacer that I was talking about in a few moments. Again, the details with this threadless stem is it's 10 millimeters shorter. It's a -7-degree stem rather than the 17 like this quill stem. So it's gonna have a little bit of a rise. That's another detail too, that I went with the silver version of the threadless stem adapter rather than the black, because the headset that it's already on this bike does have a bit of silver in it, and I feel like it matches a lot better than if I went with all black. I think it'll be a little too out of place. Again, quill stems are king. I'm not acknowledging that this is looking any better, but just for the sake of the video and my experimentation on my bike fit, I'm just gonna go with this for now. All right, so I finally got my spacer prepped. Basically, I just took some hockey tape and wrapped it a few times. I'm sure you can use like a pop can, putting it in there, shims, different techniques, but with my available resources, this is what I did for now. And that's why I didn't grease the threadless stem adapter yet, because I'm gonna take it out, put the spacer in, and then I'll be able to grease it and insert it back in there. All right, I I'd have to say that turned out really good. I'm glad that it looks pretty uniform and not out of place. If you noticed before I slammed everything down, the spacer was a little bit on the crooked side. Again, it's not precise and it's kind of a makeshift thing that you have to do. When you do bring the stem down and put some pressure on the spacer and the headset, it does keep it nice and even, so that crookedness does go away. All right, next is getting the brake lever back onto the bars. You gotta make sure that the rubber doesn't get pinched in there and it might rip. So keep a lookout on that. I'm gonna sit here and eyeball it just for a few moments, but as you can see from this angle, it looks pretty much the same. Again, that's why I do all the multiple markings, just to make sure it lines up exactly how it was. Yeah, that is looking pretty good. All right, now that the brake lever is clamped down, I'm gonna adjust the angle of the bars and then tighten down the faceplate. And always tighten down with that X pattern. All right, so whenever you do your own maintenance or do projects like this by yourself, sometimes you'll gloss over things and something does pop up where it's not detrimental, but you should just fix it now rather than later. Right now, the front brake cable housing is in front of the rear brake cable housing, causing it to push against the bars. It doesn't look the best. I could probably get away with it, and there's no specific standards. Just like right brakes for rear and left for front and vice versa if you're in Europe. So I'm still going to swap the cables, so to me it will look a little bit better in my opinion. So I did edit that clip, but the uncut clip was only 1:30. Seriously, it is so easy to work on these bikes. It's such a breeze. Now that I have the housing swapped, let me tape up the front brake cable housing. Now next is rewrapping the bars and we should be all set. And there you have it, start to finish of converting a quill stem setup to a threadless stem setup on a vintage road bike. Now, if it looks kind of easy, it's only because I've done this process maybe 6-7 times. So I'm pretty used to it. I know what to expect. But if this is something you're interested in, I hope this video really sheds some light on the entire process, things to consider, and compromises that you're willing to accept, because the thing with a quill stem is it has an infinite amount of adjustability given the limitations of your cable housings. So that's the pro with the quill stem, but now I can swap the stem a lot more easier and not have to unwrap the bar tape and rewrap it over and over. Maybe I'll check out different angles and sizes in the near future. Also, did you notice I never touched the shifting system whatsoever? Completely separate, makes it way more easier to work on. But if you're looking to see some ride footage of this setup with the threadless stem on this bike, be sure to subscribe because that video will be coming in the near future. Once again, thank you so much for joining me in this video. I truly do appreciate it. Thanks for subscribing and commenting. But if you have any questions about this process, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll be sure to answer them. Or if you have additional tips that might help me next time I do this, or anything I did wrong, let me know. Thanks again for joining me, and as always, I'll catch you in the next video.